Conflict in Communication. Week 4, Communication. Analyzing Communication. This video discusses key terms, theories, models, and tools that you can use to analyze interpersonal communication. By the end of this video, you should be able to 1. Identify and categorize interpersonal communication, and 2. Identify communication factors which may influence conflict situations. These include why we communicate and how we communicate. Review. So we've been working with the model of conflict that suggests we can divide it into episodes of conflict, which includes attitudes, behaviors, and core issues, all of which interrelate, as well as epicenters, which include various things like situational context, relational context, as well as broader structural contexts and cultural contexts, all of which have histories. In this video, we're focusing right here on behaviors, particularly communication behaviors. However, I want everyone to remember that behaviors intersect with attitudes and core issues. Identifying interpersonal communication. So last week we talked about how we can identify interpersonal relationships using either a quantitative or qualitative definition. We can approach how we identify interpersonal communication in the same way. That is, there are two approaches, a quantitative approach and a qualitative approach. The quantitative approach focuses on the number of parties involved, and a qualitative approach focuses on the characteristics of the communication itself, or you could say the characteristics of the communicative act. Like this. This is a communicative act. With the quantitative definition, we can say that interpersonal communication occurs anytime two people or a dyad communicate. So my communication with the cashier at Safeway, interpersonal. All of my communication exchanges with each one of you, interpersonal. Communication with close friends, same thing. And communication with my husband, all interpersonal. Some scholarship also suggests that we can talk about triadic communication, so that is interpersonal communication between three people. Much of this research focuses on healthcare settings, and in particular, communication that occurs between, say, a child, his or her caregiver, and a physician. This would be an example of triadic communication. With the qualitative definition, we focus on the characteristics of the communication itself, and we use the same criteria that we use to identify interpersonal relationships. Interpersonal communication goes beyond just following standard impersonal exchanges and social rules. The way we will communicate with one person whom we are close to will differ from the way we would communicate with someone else we are close to. Consider, for example, things like teasing, joking, or even swearing. The way we would communicate, say, with our siblings or close friends would probably differ from the way we would communicate with, for example, grandparents. Because of this uniqueness, interpersonal communication is irreplaceable. If, for example, you have a particular set of inside jokes with one friend, and then you two have a falling out and no longer speak, you can't then just go and recreate those inside jokes with someone else. The communication that you had with this old friend is actually rooted in the experiences that you shared with them. So it's irreplaceable. Interpersonal communication is also characterized by high levels of self-disclosure, which again we talked about last week. That is, it's characterized by talking about not only a wide variety of subjects, but also discussing these subjects in considerable depth. So there's both breadth and depth. So the information is not just superficial, but also often personally revealing. Interpersonal communication is also characterized by intrinsic rewards. This kind of speaks to the pleasure of communicating with someone that we care about. Lastly, interdependence is another feature of interpersonal communication. Our communication with the other person has a deep impact on our lives, just as we have an impact on their lives. The qualitative definition also suggests that the opposite of interpersonal communication is impersonal communication. So let's go back to my examples. Generally, the communication between myself and the cashier would probably be impersonal. Most of my one on one exchanges with each of you would still be qualitatively impersonal, although I think that's already starting to change. My exchanges with close friends will most likely be qualitatively interpersonal, as would be my communication with my husband. Impersonal communication can also become more qualitatively interpersonal over time. That is, as people have more contact and spend more time together, the quality of their communication often changes, particularly as they disclose more personal information about themselves. Hence, in reality, communication is rarely totally impersonal or totally interpersonal. Rather, it's more of a matter of degree. In fact, even communication in our closest relationships can vary, at times being impersonal and at times interpersonal. So, for example, while I have an interpersonal relationship with my husband, and while our communication is often at the high end of the interpersonal spectrum, we do still communicate in impersonal ways at times. For example, when we're deciding what to have for dinner. So, there are different degrees of impersonal and interpersonal communication within relationships as well. Pause the video. Think of examples of interpersonal communication and impersonal communication that occur within one of your closest relationships. Classifying interpersonal communication. One way to classify interpersonal communication is to think in terms of the context within which the communication occurs. So we can talk about intra-family communication, communication within friendships, professional communication, and communication that occurs within intimate relationships. And we can identify particular characteristics of communication that occurs within these different settings. And of course, I want to ask, can you think of any context that might be missing from this list? One additional point I want to make is that, as we did when classifying interpersonal relationships, we can also talk about how internal working models influence the way we communicate. Again, internal working models are developed primarily, but not exclusively, through our early family experiences and friendships. And these models kind of set the basic structure for how we communicate throughout our lives. Another way to classify interpersonal communication is to think about how it relates to the notion of culture. Specifically, we can determine to what extent, that is, to what degree, a communication interaction could be classified as intercultural. For our purposes here, I'm using the definition of intercultural communication from the textbook that I used last year. These authors suggest that intercultural communication occurs when members of two or more cultures exchange messages in a manner that is influenced by their different cultural perceptions and symbol systems. Once again, intercultural communication occurs when members of two or more cultures exchange messages in a manner that is influenced by their different cultural perceptions and symbol systems. This means that intercultural communication doesn't necessarily occur every single time two people from different cultural backgrounds interact. Rather, it only occurs when those backgrounds matter. That is, when those different cultural perceptions and symbol systems actually impact the communication exchange. So, again, we can talk in terms of degree. In this case, in terms of degree of intercultural or interpersonal significance. That is, in some instances, our one on one communication with someone from a different culture is more impacted by how well we know the other person as an individual. In other instances, our communication exchange may be more impacted by different cultural perspectives. I'm going to guess that everyone in this class has friendships with people from different cultural backgrounds. Think of those times when you had discussions with your friends about culture, or when you realized that the two of you didn't see the world in exactly the same way because of the influence of your culturally shaped perspectives. Hence, we can talk about degree, including degrees of intercultural and interpersonal communication within a given relationship. So, this is one way of identifying intercultural communication. I'm curious to hear if you agree with this definition and analysis. You'll notice that I didn't actually define culture. I'm doing this intentionally because I'm guessing that you have your own definitions shaped by your academic learning and personal experiences. And these different ways of conceptualizing culture shape how we understand the impact of culture on our identities, perceptions, and behavior. So I'm asking you to learn and be able to apply this definition that I presented here, but I don't want to suggest this is the only way of approaching this material, and I'm hoping that we get a chance to explore other conceptualizations in class. Pause the video. Think of examples of interpersonal communication and intercultural communication that occur within one of your closest relationships. Why we communicate. Let's go back to human needs theory. Last week, we discussed one model of human needs that includes the need for inclusion, control, and affection. This model is called the Fundamental Interpersonal Relationships Orientation, or FIRO, and it was developed by William Schultz in 1958. This model specifically identifies interpersonal needs, that is, those needs that we fulfill through communication in interpersonal relationships. You can also think more generally about basic human needs, identifying, for example, our basic survival needs, like for food and water, well being needs, including mental and physical health and wellness, our social needs for things like inclusion, control, and affection, and identity needs, that is, to have a sense of who we are and our place within our families, communities, and the world in general. Again, this is one way of conceptualizing basic human needs. Are there any other categories that you think should be added? Regardless of the model being used, scholarship on interpersonal communication often emphasizes that communication with others is vital for meeting all of our basic human needs. Further, scholarship on communication in conflict situations often suggests that in these situations we should always try to identify the need that the parties involved in the conflict are trying to meet through their communicative acts. Pause the video. Think of an example of how you use communication to meet each of these basic needs. Sorry for the little typo in this box here. How we communicate. Communication models. So here I'm basically going to run through all of the models presented in Chapter 1 of the course textbook. These models are useful, but I want everyone to remember that they were all developed within Western academic settings and were heavily influenced by the cultural context of those settings. Further, many reflect the development of mass communication technologies. So again, these models are useful and good to know, but they aren't the only way of conceptualizing communication dynamics. As I mentioned in our first class together, there are two general approaches to conceptualizing communication. First is through linear or transmission models. These models propose that there is always a sender and a receiver, and that the sender sends the message to the receiver, who may or may not send feedback back to the sender. Another way of conceptualizing communication is through transactional models, and these are the types of models that we're going to be using primarily within this course. The textbook specifically describes the transactional communication model proposed by Dean Barland in 1970. This model suggests that interpersonal communication exchanges occur simultaneously, so we really can't identify a clear sender and receiver. Rather, both parties are conceptualized as communicators, both of which are constantly sending messages back and forth. Further, all of these messages have two dimensions: a content dimension and a relational dimension. The content dimension includes the information that is explicitly being discussed. The relational dimension refers to how the communicators feel about each other. So again, every message has both of these dimensions. And the way that we interpret every message is shaped by our own perceptions, which are rooted in our own experiences. The Barland model uses the term fields of experience to indicate how our backgrounds influence the way that we continuously send, receive, and interpret messages. Our ability to send, receive, and interpret messages may also be impacted by various forms of noise. These are distractions which occur within our internal and external environments. Types of noise can be categorized as external, psychological, and physiological. Lastly, as with conflict, communication transactions occur within particular situational, relational, structural, and cultural contexts. So, how did this idea of transactional communication come about? The textbook outlines various models that kind of present how our understandings of interpersonal communication have evolved. The textbook starts by taking us way back to the 4th century BCE with the Aristotelian model of communication. This is very clearly a linear model of communication that is based upon the study of rhetoric. In this model, a sender sends a message to a receiver, specifically an audience of one or more people. In this model, the goal of all communication is to persuade, and in order to do that, the sender needs to understand the demographics of the audience. That is, the sender needs to think about how they can communicate in a way that will persuade the audience of their point. The model also suggests that senders rely on three main strategies, which are called appeals, to persuade an audience. Source credibility appeals, which lever the experience and likability of the sender, logical appeals, which try to persuade through reasoning, and emotional appeals. This breakdown of strategies is quite useful, particularly when analyzing political speeches. So, overall, this model introduces the idea of a sender, a message, and receiver. Jumping ahead many centuries, we come to Laswell's effects model of communication. This is also a linear model that keeps the idea of a sender, message, and receiver. However, Laswell adds the idea of a channel, which is the medium used to transmit the message. We can break channels down into two categories. The first are face-to-face channels, which include things like speech and body language that we use in one-on-one interaction. The second includes other forms of mediated channels, like writing, visual, and computer-mediated communication. Laswell also suggests that messages have multiple intended and unintended effects on receivers. This suggests that the sender doesn't have complete control over the impact of their message. The Shannon-Weaver model was developed around the same time as Laswell's. This model is based on developments in communications technology during this period. It uses many of the same ideas as Laswell's model, but gives them different names. Don't worry about memorizing these other terms. They're not super helpful to our work in this class. I'm going to keep using the terms sender, message, receiver, channel, and effect. The model does add a few other helpful ideas. Firstly, Shannon and Weaver identify processes of coding and decoding. That is, a sender can't transmit their thoughts directly into the brain of another person. They need to code the message using symbol systems like language and different forms of nonverbal communication. That is, to put it into a form that can be effectively transmitted to the receiver. Obviously, then, the receiver needs to decode the message and then interpret it, to understand it and identify its intended meaning. Shannon Weaver also introduced the idea of noise. Noise refers to any internal or external interference that may impact the coding, sending, receiving, and decoding of a message. Noise can be further broken down into three categories: physiological, psychological, and external. Physiological and psychological noise are both internal. Physiological noise would be any physical factors that impact the communication process. Hearing loss, hunger, or tiredness would be forms of physiological noise. Psychological noise are mental or emotional factors that might interfere with communication. Think of how much harder it is to really listen to someone if you're feeling angry or sad or are worried about an exam you have coming up in a few hours. External noise is anything in the immediate physical environment, like being in a noisy crowded room or a classroom with too many tables. All of these forms of noise can impact the transmission of a message. Shannon and Weaver also added the idea of feedback to identify how a receiver responds to a message. This starts to move us away from linear models of communication into a more circular conceptualization with the idea of feedback loops. The Schramm model of communication keeps the ideas of coding and decoding channels and noise. However, Schramm argues that communication is not a linear process. In a communication exchange, it's not really possible to identify a clear beginning point and a clear end point. So this model moves away from the terms sender and receiver and replaces both with the term communicators. And the idea is that both communicators constantly share messages back and forth. So now we have the terms communicators, message, channel, and effect, along with the terms coding, decoding, noise, and feedback. But now we clearly think more in terms of circular processes. Schramm also adds the term field of experience to account for the way in which our different personal, cultural, and social backgrounds influence the way in which we code, send, receive, and decode messages. This also suggests that the more two communicators' fields of experiences overlap, the smoother the communication interaction will be. Moving on, Frank Dance employed many of the same ideas as Schramm, but suggested that communication processes are not really circular. Rather, they are better understood as a spiral or a helix. So, interpersonal communication isn't this mechanical back and forth process, but is more organic. It's dynamic, ongoing, unrepeatable, additive, and cumulative. As we communicate, our understandings of ourselves and the other party widens and deepens. Further, past communication exchanges influence future communication exchanges. That is, the past has an impact on the present moment. It's kind of like the saying you can never step in the same river twice, because the constant flow of the water means that the river is never quite the same moment to moment. Similarly, past communication exchanges and the constant flow of communication processes influence current and future exchanges. This finally brings us to the transactional communication model. Transactional theory suggests that interpersonal communication is a dynamic process of continual change, impacting and being impacted by the parties involved, their relationship, and the context. According to this model, we are constantly communicating. We can't stop doing it, mainly because we are constantly sending messages through unintentional nonverbal communication. Keep in mind that this idea applies primarily to face interpersonal communication. So things like sending an email or a letter would be considered interactive, but not transactional because they don't happen simultaneously. The transactional model also brings the idea of context to the forefront, stressing the impact of situational, relational, structural, and cultural factors. So at this point, we can start to see the limits of these static, almost mechanical models of communication that seem to suggest the process is really neat, clean, and easy to follow and control. Rather, it might be far more accurate to think of interpersonal communication more like, well, a dance, as an organic, ongoing, fluid art form that we can't totally predict. That being said, like a dance, interpersonal communication isn't totally random. We still need patterns of some form, social and cultural tendencies that provide some form of structure and help us make sense of each other. One additional model that I want to discuss is Ferguson's critical communication model. This is a more recent model coming out in around 2006 that is developed by Sherry Devereaux Ferguson, who is also one of the authors of our course textbook. This model suggests that while communication is an organic, fluid, complex process, it isn't necessarily an equal one. Hence, we need to carefully consider the effects or the costs of communicative acts on any of the parties who may be impacted, be they individuals, groups, or society as a whole. Remember how we talked about how we need to balance both effectiveness and appropriateness in our communication. Well, if we're only concerned about being effective, that is, if we're only concerned about meeting our goals at all costs, we're going to cause harm to others. Similarly, if all we care about is our impact on other people, if we're too appropriate, we'll end up hurting ourselves. This identification and weighing of costs becomes even more important when we introduce the idea of power to interpersonal communication models. In week 2 of class, I suggested that we can often identify higher power parties and lower power parties in a given relationship. This is a really simplistic conceptualization of power, but let's work with it for now. So consider this. In a communication exchange where there is an explicit power imbalance, which party would be more likely to have to bear the costs of the communication exchange? Not all parties have to bear the costs of communication equally, and the lower power party is at a much greater risk of harm. This means that we need to consider the ethical dimensions of communication, particularly if we find ourselves in a position of higher power. Ferguson suggests a few criteria that can be used to weigh the costs of a communication exchange. These include the intent of the party, the legitimacy of means used by the party, which would relate to how much harm could potentially be caused, the nature of the power relationship, or the extent of the power inequality, and the outcomes of the communication on all of the parties. Pause the video. What components of these different communication models can aid in the analysis of interpersonal conflict? Principles of interpersonal communication. So given what we've learned from these communication models, what general principles can we identify that can help us when analyzing communication, particularly as it relates to conflict situations? First off, remember that communication can be intentional or unintentional. This means that while we can shape how we communicate in conflict situations, we can't totally control the messages that we send or how those messages are interpreted by the other party. Or in other words, our communication has both intentional and unintentional effects. This highlights how meaning is constructed within interpersonal communication. We don't directly communicate meaning to each other. We make meaning within ourselves and in collaboration with other parties. So we can say that the meaning of our messages that we send actually exist in and among people. That is, each party in a communication exchange constructs meaning within themselves based upon how they interpret those messages through their lens of their own perceptions, which are, of course, shaped by our fields of experience. Meanings also exist among people because through communication exchanges, we can develop kind of a growing mutual understanding. Conflict situations really highlight how our perceptions influence the way that we understand the messages that we receive. This relates to the notion of content and relational dimensions within communication interactions. Remember, when we communicate, we don't just communicate information, we also convey how we feel about the person we are communicating with. That is, our messages always have a relational dimension, and interpreting the relational dimension of messages is often more difficult than accurately interpreting content. We have also talked about how interpersonal communication is simultaneous or transactional and ongoing. This means that we really can't totally control communication processes, which also makes communication in conflict situations more challenging. As does the fact that communication is irreversible and unrepeatable. We can never really take back the messages that we have sent. We can only send new messages that alter how past messages are understood. This also reminds us that what worked in one situation may not necessarily work in another. And lastly, we need to consider the ethical dimensions of communication, particularly as it relates to the costs associated with being effective and appropriate, and how these costs are shaped by power relationships. There are also a few points we can make about the context within which interpersonal communication occurs. When analyzing the situational context of interpersonal communication, we can identify the role of, for example, noise and communication channels. When analyzing the cultural context, we can consider fields of experience and the degree of intercultural significance in a communication interaction. The textbook also defines standpoint theory and its relation to this. Standpoint theory basically suggests that our personal backgrounds and experiences shape how we see the world. When analyzing relational contexts, we consider the degree to which the communication is interpersonal, impersonal, or again, intercultural. We can also discuss power relationships. On page 24 in the textbook, the authors outline 5 sources of power, including rewards, legitimacy, expertise, the capacity for coercion, and referent power. I would make a point of studying and memorizing these 5 definitions for the quiz. In terms of structural context, we can also talk about power, but in this case, more in terms of how information flows are controlled within, say, an institution or society more generally. Consider, for example, the different ways in which mass media and social media shape access to information. On page 25 in the textbook, the authors outline 3 models of information access: a trickle-down model, simultaneous model, and open access model. We will look at these eventually in the class, but not yet, so don't worry about them for the purposes of this quiz. And again, given the different ways contexts influence communication interactions, we need to consider the ethical implications of communication, which again ties into this idea of power relationships. Pause the video. How could these different communication principles aid in the analysis of interpersonal conflict? This video discussed key terms, theories, models, and tools that you can use to analyze interpersonal communication. You should be able to identify and categorize interpersonal communication, and identify communication factors which may influence conflict situations, including why we communicate and how we communicate.